Okay, so good morning, everyone, and a very warm welcome to this, which is our second online GFD workshop of this semester. So my name's Johnny Woodward. I'm the director of the Global Faculty Development Initiative here at Komaba. So before we start, let me first just explain that this workshop is going to be available. The original workshop is in English, and we will have simultaneous Japanese interpretation. So if you go to your Zoom menu, you should see at the bar at the bottom of your Zoom window that there's an interpretation button with a little world picture. If you click on that, you can choose between English and Japanese. So please choose the language that you'd like to listen to the presentation in. The entire workshop will be working in this kind of bilingual way. So if you wish to ask questions in English or Japanese, that's not a problem. So if you ask a question in Japanese, it will be interpreted for the presenter and for everyone else. So make sure to use the language setting that applies to you. Okay, so I just wanted to take this opportunity to say a few words about some of the activities that GFD that may be of interest to some of you. So besides kind of workshops like this and other activities and events that you'll see advertised, one of the things we try to do at GFD is provide resources to faculty at the University of Tokyo, particularly to those faculty who are teaching courses in languages other than Japanese. And there are sort of two programs I'd like to highlight that may be useful to you if you fall into this category. The first is called LOOK, which stands for Learning and Observing Outside Komaba. And basically our goal here is to assist faculty who are interested in attending conferences on teaching and learning or observing, for example, innovative practices at other universities. Now, of course, with the current virus situation, it's difficult to travel, but certainly if you're interested in attending online conferences, then please apply to us and we can help you with things like registration fees. Okay, so that's the first one I'd like to mention. The second program is called TASTE, which stands for Testing Active Learning Sessions for Teaching Enhancement. And here is where we can provide resources, and that can be financial help, it can be advice, it can also be peer feedback. If you're interested in trying to introduce new active learning type elements into your teaching. So if you've got, for example, ideas or new things you'd like to try in the classroom and you're not quite sure how to start, then get in touch with us, put in an application, and we can help you with that. We can use the money to buy things like software licenses or resources, books, materials that you might need to get going. So both of these programs are very straightforward to apply for. And again, due to the coronavirus situation, there's no deadlines at the moment. You can apply at any time. So I'm going to post our website in the chat. Do visit the website and do take a look at these programs and drop in an application if you're interested. Okay, so in just a moment, I'll hand over to my colleague, Isabel Girodo, to introduce today's workshop. But just before we do, hopefully you will all receive soon or have already received a feedback form for this event. I would really ask you if you could take just a minute or so to fill that in, because those feedback forms are really helpful in allowing us to make sure we continue to do things that are useful and of interest to people. So I'd really like to ask for your help with that. Okay, with all that said, I'm sorry for taking up your time, and now let me hand over to Isabel, who will introduce today's workshop, and I hope you all enjoy it. It's a great pleasure for us to have Kim Fortun here today. So, okay, bye-bye.
Thank you, Johnny. So again, as Johnny said, there is an interpretation function into Japanese. So you just need to push the interpretation button, which you should be able to find in the bottom menu, as you can choose between, English and Japanese. So I would like to thank you again very much for attending this workshop today. It's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Kim Fortun. Let me provide a little bit of background about her. Dr. Kim Fortun is a professor in the University of California, Irvine Department of Anthropology. Her research and teaching focus on environmental risk and disaster, data practices and politics, and experimental ethnographic methods and research design. Her research has examined how people in different geographic and organizational contexts understand environmental problems, uneven distributions of environmental health risks, developments in the environmental health sciences, and factors that contribute to disaster vulnerability. Currently, she's working on a range of collaborative projects, including the asthma files, the quotidian Anthropocene project, and the transnational disaster STS COVID-19 project, all supported by the Platform for Experimental Collaborative Ethnography. Dr. Fortun served as president of the Society for Social Studies of Science, as some of you may know, the international scholarly society representing the field of science and technology studies. She'll tell us more about her research and teaching activities in a few minutes, but I'd like to mention one of the reasons that we're invited Dr. Kim Fortun today. Several of us here actually have a strong teaching and research interest in case-based education, and through the GFD program, we've been seeking to promote its development, in particular in the field of environmental and sustainability studies. Actually, this event is the first one of a series of workshops we would like to devote to innovative case-based learning. Importantly, this ongoing discussion is fully open to students, and among the participants today, we have indeed a few of them. So today, Dr. Fortun's talk will be split in two parts. First, she's going to tell us more about her own research background, as well as the historical development, theoretical and methodological aspects of the course Environmental Justice. And after that, we'll have a first question and answer session. Then after a short break, about 5 minutes, the second part of her talk will focus on the practical aspects of a student case study research, as well as the possible development of teaching and research collaborations. And then we'll have another and final short question and answer session. So with that, I would like to turn it over to Kim. Please, Kim, if you want to share your PowerPoints.
Good morning, everyone. I'll just share my screen. Okay. So I've titled my presentation, Building Critical Capacities Through Environmental Case Study Research. I want to start with a brief description of my research so that it is clear how my teaching in this manner extends from this. I started my research career at the site of the 1984 Union Carbide chemical plant disaster in Bhopal, India, 6 years after the gas leak, when the case was in the Indian Supreme Court. The case was about how local harms were produced within a global system through the interplay of location, social inequality, technologies, labor organization, global trade agreements, legal logic and processes, and so on. I thus learned early about the importance of pulling many different kinds of analyses into a single frame. I went on to study similar fence line communities in the United States, like this one in Houston, Texas, near where I grew up. On the left side, you see a data visualization showing the over 40 high-risk industrial facilities in the Houston area, with potential for Bhopal-like releases of toxic chemicals. The blue dots are schools. The visualization thus shows both risk and vulnerability. The data behind these visualizations was available to the activist organization that made it because of environmental right to know laws passed in the United States after the Bhopal disaster. As you'll see, one of the goals of the case study approach that I use is to teach students to access and leverage data resources like the ones that you see here. Data resources collected by government agencies, activist organizations, to turn them into reports to help us characterize environmental injustice at the community level. I've also done research on slower and less dramatic environmental problems like air pollution, finding a lot of purchase in a comparative approach. What you see here is a slide showing a recent study we've done comparing air pollution governance in now 12 cities around the world. My focus here is on how I work with students to develop environmental injustice case studies in a lower division, large enrollment undergraduate course, which can be offered in person or fully online. In this course, the students work in research groups to develop 3 case studies focused on highly polluted communities in California. The first focused on explosive disasters like the Bhopal disaster. The second focused on routine pollution, what we call slow disasters. And the third on combination disasters associated with climate change. I'm fortunate to work with a very skilled and creative teaching team who you see on the slide here. Fall 2020, we had over 200 students, and we used the red TT markers in our online engagements with the students so that they can easily see the teaching team's presence in their online work. I use a similar approach to teaching in a master's level course for students specializing in radiation health hazards at the University of Nagasaki. All of those students are from outside Japan, most of them from countries dealing with extensive radiation hazards from mines, weapons developments, testing, etc. In that course, I work through a few cases with the students. Then each student individually develops their own case study report. There are also others teaching and working with this material, both in the US and outside. And together we're hoping to build a network of environmental educators that are able to share materials and thus improve the content we bring to our students, but importantly, to connect our students so that they can provide a next generation of environmental leadership. These are the learning outcomes of the course. The first, to help students think anthropologically about environmental health problems and injustice, bringing social science perspective to their understanding, even if their primary area of study is another field. We have many science students in our course and many engineering students. The second goal is for students to be able to identify multiple environmental health hazards, stakeholders, and solution pathways. The third is to analyze ways environmental health threats intersect with poverty, racism, and other social problems. So really integrated in environmental hazard analysis with social and political economic analysis. The fourth and a very important goal is for the course to give students an opportunity to better articulate their own ethical values, political perspectives, and professional commitments. And last, we want to teach them the digital tools and infrastructure that will enable them to do collaborative research in our class and later on beyond our class. These are some of the digital tools that we use in our class. I can comment more on them in the question period if people are interested. We use the basic course software that's offered by our university, an LMS system called Canvas. The students set up a Discord platform for their own exchanges around their case study research. I barely touch it. It's a completely student-run space. They also use Zotero, an open access bibliographic tool that allows students to build shared bibliographies. And then last, we publish their work on a research platform that's shared by researchers at all stages of their research. So linking students to more senior researchers, and I'll show you that in a moment. In order to to create more space for student collaboration in the course, we circulate a series of course bulletins that really do some of the work of lectures. And so in a 10-week course, every 2 weeks, students get a course bulletin that introduces them to the hazard focused on in that module, gives them, helps them move through historic cases of that hazard. For example, they work with material on the Bhopal disaster, preparing them for their own case study research. And so for each course module, students start with shared content focused on a particular theme. The shared content includes many documentary films that we encourage students to watch in 3 ways: as film critics, as anthropologists, and as activists. Importantly, we encourage them to watch the documentary films in a way that somewhat simulates the field research that's at the center of a lot of anthropological research, because we want to prepare students, like an anthropologist, to go into a new setting and quickly understand its character and dynamics. Throughout the course, we return to the value of looking at things from many perspectives. So on the left here is a template we provide to guide students through note-taking on shared content. And as you'll see at the center of it, we ask them to identify multiple stakeholders and the way those stakeholders see the problem at hand, and to try and understand what shapes that understanding. So stakeholders, their perceptions of problems, and the backstory behind those perceptions. Across the initiatives in the course, we return to key concepts, seeing these key concepts as analytic tools that they can use in the course and beyond. And the final exam in the course is designed to test their understanding of these concepts, but also importantly, to remind them of the concepts that they've learned throughout the course. So our students are able to see the questions in advance and are encouraged to study together. We want taking the exam to be empowering, helping them recognize the many concepts that they've learned to work with in a very practical way in the course. This question, for example, reminds students that they've learned to identify media injustice. They also learn to identify instances of intergenerational injustice in the cases that they work on. This slide points to foregrounds the difference between climate change denial and climate change mitigation. Again, our choice of concepts is concepts that can help them analytically, both in their case studies in our course and beyond. Many of our questions have examples, such as this one about a toxic waste site in California that was at the center of a wildfire in 2018, which led to more than usual pollution from the site, which impacted its water treatment system. And with this example, we want students to recognize that what they're dealing with is a compound or combination disaster. Again, the concepts that we foreground are selected to strengthen the students' analytic capabilities. The course is also designed to give students an opportunity to refine and articulate their own ethical values, political perspectives, and professional commitments. They have the opportunity to do this in discussion boards in each module and in a section of their case studies in which they identify and prioritize action items that would improve conditions in the communities their case studies focus on. A collaborative group assignment in the last weeks of the course puts this learning outcome in the foreground. Together, students develop a position paper that articulates their position on a selection of debatable issues. Right now, for example, students are working in their research groups of about 10 students each, taking positions on 10 issues, 10 debatable issues. But collaborative case study development is at the heart of the course. Here is the case study framework we use and the schedule through which the undergraduate students develop their case study reports in a 10-week course. I'll return to each of these questions one by one in the second part of the presentation, but just to quickly give you a sense of the scope, they start by describing the setting of a case. Question 2 is really the heart of the case, the environmental hazard at hand, whether it's a Bhopal-like explosive disaster hazard, a hazard from uranium mining, a hazard from routine air pollution. The third question focuses on intersecting factors that exacerbate the harms and vulnerabilities in that community and undermine their capacity to respond. So if in question 1, describing the setting of the case, we ask them to draw out the assets in a community that empower a community to identify and work on the social problems they face. Question 3 is the inverse of that. It's the factors in a community that undermine their capacity to characterize and respond to the problems they face. Question 4 asks about stakeholders. Question 5 asks what stakeholders have done and, importantly, often not done in response to the problems. Question 6 asks about how the problems have been addressed by media, environmental groups, government and companies, government agencies. Importantly, in this question, we ask students to draw out where there has been what we call data divergence, different characterizations of the problems in the community, especially different interpretations of health impacts. 7 asks what local actions would reduce environmental vulnerability and injustice in the setting. 8 asks for extra local actions, action at the national level, for example, at the provincial, state, or even transnational level. Question 9 is one of my favorite questions, which I'll say more about later. It asks students to identify the data that we need to collect in order to better understand the hazards in that setting. It also asks them to design a qualitative study that would help us characterize the environmental hazards in that setting. And then last, we ask them to characterize the ethical wrongs and injustices in this case. And as you'll see in the second part, we have a sketch that they do to support this. And we ask them to identify multiple forms of injustice that intersect to produce environmental injustice. Media injustice, data injustice, procedural injustice, reproductive injustice, and so on. So again, the goal is to help students collaboratively produce a multifactorial complex analysis of an environmental hazard at the community level. We emphasize to students that their case study research can be an important resource in the communities they study and a contribution to the environmental justice movements. Students are encouraged but not required to publish their case studies on the digital platform supporting the Disaster STS network. And I'll note that there's space for case study work by students at other universities to share publication space on this platform. We found that this kind of publication has a profound effect on students, helping them see themselves as experts who can make important civic contributions. So what you're seeing here is the case studies produced by our students in fall 2019, working in about 15 communities. This quarter, we're working in about 20 communities across California. So and you see the 3 types of case studies they work on: fast disaster or explosive disaster, routine pollution, and combination disaster is the climate change focus studies. We also remind students that this kind of case study work can be important parts of their resumes, helping them see the value of their social science education in career readiness. We show them, for example, how they can list their case study publications on their resume and identify the kind of analyses they've learned to do: stakeholder analyses, community asset analyses, injustice analyses. We also remind students that the collaborative development of case studies is an important activity in many organizations where they might go on to work. The reports used here, which we use as data resources in their case studies, are produced by different agencies in the state of California, but they're good examples. The kind of report that these agencies produce, the California Department of Public Health and the California Fourth Climate Change Assessment, all work with a form of a case study format and clearly all collaboratively rendered. We also remind students that many of the organizations from which we get data for their case studies are potential employers. So for example, when they go to access data from the US Environmental Protection Agency or the California Environmental Protection Agency or the California Department of Education, all of those are organizations that could be career pathways for students. An important part of the course is to help students learn to think like social scientists, leveraging an array of methods, both traditional and new. So as I mentioned, one question in the case study asked them to design a qualitative study that would help characterize the community they're focused on in the case study. A new method that we highlight is what we've called data ethnography, where you search for data about asthma rates, for example, or ozone levels to learn about those things, but also to learn about the knowledge infrastructure available or missing for problem characterization in a particular region. So in each case study, students access and pull data and visualizations from many different publicly available data sets. The US Census, for example, toxic emission data from the US Environmental Protection Agency, climate data from many different sources. Some of the data directly points to environmental stressors, ozone levels or water pollution data, for example. Other data is proxy data that helps us characterize community vulnerability. School absence data, for example, is good proxy data for understanding missing infrastructure, transportation to get to school, for example. Low educational attainment data points to the potential lack of expertise at the community level for problem solving. There's also available data on low levels of civic engagement and political empowerment, which also points to a community vulnerability. Teaching students to learn to think about proxy data that may have been produced for one purpose, but can be used for another purpose, is an important combined creative and analytic skill that we return to. These are the types of data resources that we have students access, interpret, and present in their case study reports. This is one we use, the California Fourth Climate Change Assessment. In our Q&A period, I'm interested if in the Japanese context, what kind of data might be available for your students to use in this kind of research. We also use data from public health authorities at both the county, state, and national level in the US. This is data that is produced by our public utilities, the electricity companies that create fire risk data. And it's an important part of the work of the teaching team to continually keep up to date civic data resources that we can teach our students to work with. This is a different kind of data resource. This is produced by the Yale Climate Communication Project. With this data set, you can go to the county level or district level and learn about climate opinion. What percentage of the students, of the residents in the county believe that climate change will have an impact in their lifetime, for example. So again, it helps you begin to characterize sentiments and perspectives in the community, often being a jumping off point for further qualitative research. So they can move from this kind of data to the qualitative research design that's also part of the case study. And this is a data set a global data set produced by Notre Dame that provides rankings of climate readiness based on infrastructure investments, climate change planning. So again, we find it useful to teach students that these data sets are there, to look at the questions that they ask, to look at the data resources that these data aggregators pulled together, and to think about how they can be a data resource in the kind of case studies that we use. So learning to think about data, where it is, who has access to it, what it shows, what it doesn't show, where there's data missing is an important continuing theme in the course. And this is yet another data source we use. We use educational data quite extensively to get at the sociocultural context in which environmental hazards play out. And this is something called the Youth Investment Opportunity Index. Again, they do rankings that aggregate multiple data sets to create a risk score for a community for vulnerability to harm. In this case, it's a data set that was configured in order to help direct investment for youth prosperity. And so we can repurpose that data set to understand community assets and vulnerabilities in the communities we're studying to understand environmental injustice. Okay, with these images, which I hope you've had a moment to look at, I hope you can see that all of them can be seen in different ways. You can see both a duck and a rabbit. You can see a landscape. And if you look closely enough, you can see 5 horses that can be pulled from the landscape, becoming figure against a background. In many cases, an individual can't see all 5. It actually takes collaborative looking to pull all 5 horses forward. The other images too, you can see in multiple ways. And I put these kinds of images in front of students to remind them that throughout the course, we're encouraging to look at problems from many different angles, really leveraging multiple perspectives in an effort to characterize places and problems. In the case studies, we teach them to build up a place characterization piece by piece, drawing in multiple perspectives. We also, however, want students to understand the limits of all data sets and the way data can be manipulated to push problems out of view. So every view and data set is limited, which only increases the need for multiple perspectives. So through their case study research, students gain hands-on understanding of how different positioning shapes how data sets are seen and interpreted, building critical data literacies. I'll now stop and take questions, and then after the break, I'll go specifically into each part of the case study work and how we support it.
Thank you very much, Kim, for the first part of this talk. So we don't have so many participants, and so if you would like to ask a question, I think that it might be easy if you just go to the participant window, and then you can use the raise hand function. And also, if you want to ask a question in Japanese, please go ahead, and that should be no problem. Your question will be translated. So we have about 10 minutes for discussion, question and answer session.
And one thing our note is that I think a link to my slides has been put in the chat. Yes. And in the notes to the slides, there are links to much of our course material, right. The bulletins, the case study framework, etc. We're very happy to share and work collaboratively with other instructors with that material.
Right, thank you. Does anyone have any question? Let me see. Yes, please go ahead. I saw one raise. Okay, Emma and Joao, please go ahead.
Hi there. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay. Hi. Thank you so much for your presentation. My name is Emma Saraf. I work with GFD and I also recently graduated from the University of Tokyo. I had a question about data ethnography. So I was really intrigued by this concept that students should be aware both of what is available and what isn't available, sort of the unknown unknowns. And I wonder how you manage student questions about what data sets aren't available. So if, for instance, they are interested in a particular kind of information or a specific data set about a specific community and that isn't available for whatever reason, how do you sort of work around that?
Well, it's an important learning moment in the course when students are very frustrated because they can't find the data that they want. Often they're surprised by that. But this is where it's really important that the class creates a truly collaborative environment, because often a data set they want, I don't know if it's available. And I encourage them to look, or I look with them, and I'm learning side by side with them. And in a particularly deep way, because I just moved to California 3 years ago. Many of my students grew up in California and know these communities well. And I have learned so much from them about California. And so I think part of the exploration of what data isn't there really does emerge out of the collaborative process. One example I'll give, and I worry about it a lot as an instructor because of when it's too frustrating for students, is the very first case study we do focused on Bhopal-like disasters, so explosive chemical disasters. Much of data about what those are called worst case scenarios in legal language, it's not available online because industry has lobbied to keep it offline on the basis that it could be used by terrorists or for, cause a security concern, which is not wrong, but it also takes it out of citizen planning. And so it truly is an investigation to go, there's one data set we can start with to try and identify the facilities with Bhopal-like harms. But a lot of the work is documenting what they couldn't find about the facilities so we know that the facilities, we know that the facilities are there. That doesn't mean that we can find anything out about the harms that they potentially could produce. So that is an exploratory part of the course, and they're asked to document not only what they find, but also what they don't find.
Thank you.
Good morning. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Hello. Okay. So my name is Rom, and I'm currently a master's student in Kyoto University, and I am studying about environmental disasters in informal settlements in Brazil. And one typical issue that I normally found is that a lot of communities face environmental disasters, not just because they lacked any sort of urban planning and they were left to their own luck to build their communities and choose sites that were formerly undesirable and completely um, unpurposefully build a very vulnerable setting. And one thing that it's built upon that is the fact that it completely creates a setting of violence that really is mining the city's ability to cope with disaster. I From all the lists and examples you gave, I found it particularly interesting that not just here environmental disasters are discussed in the course, also combo. And I would be very glad if you could talk a little bit on what you think, how violence can be looked in this perspective of a combo disaster. And also, one very simple question I have is that seeing the framework of the course, how are all the students' work done remotely, or are they encouraged to go to communities and perform like interviews, surveys, and interact with the community? Because I ask about violence because I really want to, on the later phases of my studies, to engage with the community and really put all my knowledge to work with them and build upon that. And I find it particularly difficult in this violent context to perform any sort of activities. Thank you very much.
Yeah. Those are good questions. And the question of how other stresses in a community like violence compound the harms of pollution and environmental hazards is probably the most important thing the case study gets at. And so the third question is, what intersecting issues and dynamics make it hard to address the problems? So like last summer when we focused on Los Angeles County, where we could get police violence data, we used that data to address that question, because if you have police violence, you have low levels of cooperation between law enforcement and the community. It's a proxy data for a bigger set of problems. But the way that economic precarity undermines a community's capacity to respond, and importantly, many communities know these things in an everyday way. But I think our vision is that if we can put together the long list of compounding harms in a community, it can help a community think about itself. And in my course right now, the students are not going into the communities, even before the COVID-19 pandemic, because it's a large course, it's not for very long. But I've now started a follow-up course for more advanced students that have moved through this course. And I would like to get them in the community. But part of the course I teach now, by design, it's studying a community from a distance, using, trying to creatively find data resources that we can use to characterize the community, almost the kind of research you would do before you go to the community. But it's also not that linear, because we've started running case study workshops with community members where the students we've done it on Zoom, where we ask the students, the community members, to help us answer the questions. And so, for example, the community assets, like where is there strength in this community that we could build from? For example, there might be a really dynamic principal at a local school that is a great resource. I mean, we can't know that from afar, but the community members know it. But taking the case study framework and doing it with community members is a really rewarding. And often we can feed that insight into the case study report. So again, helping the community see itself and have a document if they do want to go to their a local government official and point to problems. It's something that they can work with. It's really empowering for my students to think that they can actually be useful to communities. And so publishing these case studies, they're imperfect reports. They're done quickly with lots of junior researchers, but they also are really impressive. And so they're very proud to take them to their communities when they're from these communities. And so I think it would be rewarding to watch this kind of process in the community you've described.
Yeah, thank you very much. I take the words in a really inspiring way to continue my studies.
Yeah. Thank you. We still have time before the break. Does anyone have other questions?
if I may, can I ask a question?
Yes, please.
Hi, my name is Satsuki Takahashi. I really enjoyed your talk, and I think we exchanged the 1 or 2 email message, but it was a while ago. I do research on Fukushima disaster, and my question is related to what you talked about. The question earlier indicated that the how to deal with the unknown, and then also the data is sometimes not available for political reasons and so forth. And in regard with the Fukushima disaster, it's really hard to find some similar data that you mentioned in terms of the violence of police force in the United States. I think there are some differences in terms of what's available, what's not available, and I'm sure that that's something that you notice from different case to different case. But one of the things that my student trying to do when they do their digital ethnography is using social network, and I was wondering if what you and your students deal with social network kind of a data.
We haven't used social network data to characterize the communities very much yet. It might be something that, and in fact, the students are interested in developing it. One thing that we do that is a step in that direction is we have students look at the Wikipedia entry for the place that they're studying and at the discussion part of Wikipedia. And it is remarkable how a Wikipedia entry that presents itself as so comprehensive. There is almost no environmental hazard data of any kind on a Wikipedia description. So a graduate student that I work with, Tim Schutz, is actually interested in making it a collective project to just build Wikipedia entries that point to radiation hazards, ozone hazards, to make it it's just like getting air pollution data in the daily newspaper was collective work of that sort. But in Wikipedia, you can look at discussion around the Wikipedia post. And again, I mean, just seeing what is commented on as missing or not. And so I think that probably the question that we could most importantly use, well, two things for the social media data is certainly the community assets, because knowing who is out there characterizing the problem is a really important first step, but also really creatively identifying data resources, including data created by community members, whether it's a network of parents that have done school monitoring, and that's very hard to see. And one of our goals in aggregating things on the Disaster STS network is to help people make that kind of data visible so that it can be a collective resource. Now, I would be very interested in what it would look like to do case study analyses, say, in different communities in Fukushima Prefecture. Like, what data could you get? It would be really, really wonderful to have that part of the set we're working with.
Any other question, comment, or insight? Oh yeah, Fujigaki sensei, please go ahead.
Can you see me? Can you hear me?
I can. Hello, it's lovely to see you.
Hi, Kim. How are you? Thank you so much for your nice presentation. I think that the topic of environmental injustice relates to the ecological citizenship. Mm-hmm. So I think your class can be categorized to the liberal arts program. So At the same time, this class can be allocated to the environmental class and also anthropologist training and also STS. So my question is, what kind of category does your class allocated in your university? And I also want to ask about the background of your students. I mean that it is a class for undergraduate or graduate, or what's the specialty of the students?
That's a good question. So the class that I teach at the University of California is for lower division undergraduates. And it's what we call a general education course. So it's a required course. So I have engineering students and science students. I have all students. And one thing that I try and encourage them to bring their discipline expertise to the case studies is, you know, and it's difficult because they're often so new in their degree programs that they don't know much about their own fields. But I want them to learn to think about what expertise they have as a civil engineer or a public health student or a sociology student. So those students are very diverse. I've in the course that I teach that is offered by the University of Nagasaki, all of those are master's level health science students. Many of them are from backgrounds where they've never had any social science or STS kind of courses. So it's a great way to, I find it the case study framework is a good way to teach social science methods to students in other fields, but also to teach them that we need their expertise also. So I think my vision is to be able to use the case study approach as a framework for really interdisciplinary education and research. And the engineers in my class are great students, and you might know for many years I taught at an institution where most of my undergraduate students were engineers, and I came to really love teaching them because they knew different things than I knew, and so but they also really needed social science perspective, but also to think. One of the things the case study does is help students think at different scales. You know, what's happening locally, what's happening at this state or district level, what's happening nationally and transnationally, so that they can realize that all of those scales produce the harms that we're trying to attend to. So it would be, I'd be very interested in hearing about how that kind of interdisciplinary education could work in Japan.
Yeah, it's very insightful question. I think that I also think that the case study is very helpful to a interdisciplinary education. Yeah, not only interdisciplinary research, but also interdisciplinary education. Thank you very much.
May I ask of those of you familiar with the Japanese context, can you access data from the Environmental Protection Agency or the Education Agency, or and I know that part of what you learn is that data practices are so different across context. But what is your sense of what publicly accessible data there would be to work with?
Some of the data, students can get data from environmental agency if the agency open the data, but not only all of the data are open. I mean that some of the data are closed inside the ministries and agencies. So the borderline of open or closed is determined by the ministry and the agency.
Do you think that agencies could be encouraged to open their data?
Yes.
Because they want students to become data literate and data creative?
Yes, of course, especially for the nuclear nuclear power and nuclear energy. Maybe Takahashi-san would like to ask.
If I may add a few things, I never thought about it in terms of the students accessing to the nuclear data, but from my perspective as an ethnographer, some of the data, a lot of the data on the nuclear substances like found in the fish body or in seawater are available. But one of the things that the students probably have trouble accessing to, there are so many terminologies that you have to know in order to get access to that specific data. So one of the things that I would imagine as an instructor to be able to do to communicate with the students is think about the different terminology of the interest of theirs and then how to access to those data. Data do exist because the government do think it's their obligation to open the publicly accessible information, but they're not really thinking about how to access to a public in any ways. I'm sure that's the same in the US, but it's especially that problem was apparent as far as I noticed in terms of the Fukushima related data.
Something I spend a lot of time on as a course designer is writing very detailed instructions on how to go into a data set, grabbing certain data and grabbing a visualization and helping the students know what they're seeing, know what they're not seeing, and write, and they have to write an interpretive caption. But I don't want to send them off into a deep data set alone with no help. But what's interesting is that when they're in there, students, they learn so much about precisely this. The data is there, but you can't make sense of it, or it could be manipulated. And so as important as them finding the data and producing a nice case study report is I want them to be data frustrated. I want them to be motivated to learn more and to be interested in how data sets are configured and available. And the other thing I'll point out is that we have people so we formed this network called the Beyond Environmental Injustice Teaching Collective. And like one of our collaborators is in Ecuador, where there's just not as much publicly available data as there is in the US. And we want to design the case study process where one, that her students learn what data could be available, but also we learn to answer questions in different ways. It's like, could they get on the phone? Could they do a 3-hour community phone survey and make up for data that we found useful in the case studies we do in California? So again, thinking creatively about how to fix data gaps in an imperfect way. And also how ethnographic and qualitative data can guide, supplement, really is integral to it, not standing alone or apart from it.
I really like that point that you want students to be frustrated with data. I think that's really nice. Thank you very much.
Thank you for this first part. The discussion is going on very vividly. They are proposed to take a few minutes, 3 minutes for the break. And please have this break, and yeah, we will continue our discussion, the presentation and the discussion in 3 minutes. So see you again very soon. See you later. So we are now going to have the second part of this session, this workshop. And please acknowledge that there will be another question and answer session. So Kim, do you want to share your PowerPoint again?
Yeah, just one moment. Okay, you're seeing my slides? Okay, here again is the case study framework at the center of our course, with the view of the schedule the students move through the development of 3 case studies in research groups of about 10 students. In a 10-week course, they do a case study in 2 weeks. In the summer, in a 5-week course, they do it in 1 week. And of course, the timing can be spread out, or it can't be much compressed. We want them to learn to self-organize as collaborative research groups. We also need to give them scaffolding to do that. And so in a 2-week period, they really move through 4 stages of where we kind of tell them to get this piece done, and then a second piece, a third piece, and a 4th piece. And I'll show you how we use a research sketchbook to help them produce an analytic draft of their case study. And so what you see on the left here is the sketchbook that students use for the combo disaster. This sketchbook the structure is the same for every case study. So by the time they do a combo disaster, they're familiar with it. And there's a couple of sketches that support each case study question to ask them, for example, to identify 4 organizations or community assets. What you see on the right is the list of figures that we ask students to include in the case study. And as I mentioned, I spend time making sure that the data visualizations, or even photographs that we're asking students to pull into their case studies, one, have analytic value, but also that they can not only present them, but interpret the data. And so that list of 20 figures is different for each case study based on the type of hazard that they're focused on. And we see the sketchbook and the list of figures, as scaffolding that helps the students produce their case study work. When they present their final case study reports, we provide them a template to put the case study in. It's much like the guidelines for submitting a journal article, where you have a style guide that you must follow. It's a learning experience for students to learn that we really need them to follow this template so that we can publish a body of case study research with the kind of standardization that visually points to the way that they are a collection. And so this is what you're seeing is the template we provide. There's links to that in the slides that I showed you. And on the right is what the PDF looks like published on the Disaster STS platform. So in the intro to the case study, one of the things we ask students do is to identify concepts that we've learned in the shared content part of the course that will help drive their analysis in the case study. So it's a way to link the more traditional kind of part of the course, learning shared content, and learn to use that in their case study research. And so they identify concepts that they then will use elsewhere in the case study. In the introduction, we also ask them to do a native land acknowledgement. And in each of their case studies, we ask them to do a little bit more interpretation. In the US, there is a growing expectation of native land acknowledgements as a way to show respect for Indigenous history and sovereignty. And just asking students to do this each time they do a case study report is a way to give them a sense of why that's called for and what it looks like in practice. The first question asks students to characterize a community setting and assets. And some of this is the basic, where is it? What kind of, is it urban? Is it rural? What's the landscape? But we also ask them to characterize the political climate of the place. So for example, in their disasters this fall that they did just after the US presidential election, we asked them to go into voter data to try and characterize the county that they were that they were focused on based on voting patterns. What you'll see in the sketch at the left is they've, in the population characteristics, we send them to a very particular data set, in this case, one that is designed to draw out racial disparities and how race overdetermines opportunity, health, et cetera, in the US. And so the assignment is very simple, to just go in and find 5 bullet points from that data set that they can use to help characterize their county. Again, this both teaches them that that data set is there and teaches them how they can leverage a data set created by other researchers. On the right is a sketch that helps them identify assets in the community. In a climate change focused case study, for example, just the extent of climate change planning in the community is an indicator of assets. We also asked them this year to characterize the kinds of incentives local governments have for climate change mitigation, for transformations of the electric grid or transportation sector, for example. So again, it's like giving them little analytic prompts where they can fill in data and interpretation in the sketchbook and then are ready to write with substance when they move to the case study template. These are the figures that we use in the setting and assets. And just for example, here we ask them to show a data visualization from some of the sources that I pointed to earlier. And this again is, instead of spending time preparing lectures, what I spend my time doing is setting up this kind of scaffolding where I can point students to a data set and help them see what they can do with it for the purpose of their case study. And so these are both data sets that we've identified that they can pull into their case studies. One thing we've learned is these data sets like this often lose their interactivity after just a few years. So we have to constantly stay on top of the freshness of the data sets that we're pointing students to. The second question focuses on environmental hazards, and this is where the case study framework can be pivoted to focus on many different things. For example, in the course that I teach with the University of Nagasaki, all of the hazards we focus on there are radiation related. We do uranium mining, test sites, et cetera. Whereas in my course in the University of California, we focused on mostly chemical toxicity, climate change. A colleague who's teaching with this approach in the eastern part of the United States, one of the main hazards in her state is industrial meat lots, like hog operations. So again, you can trade out the hazard and have a shared framework. So students learn a kind of analytic language that they can use to cut across these different kinds of hazards. These are the kinds of sketches that we do to support this question. What you see on the left, for example, is we have them go to a database that simply lists all of the facilities in a county that has a Bhopal-like worst case scenario potential. We then have those, put them on a map so that they can provide a map of worst case scenario facilities in their county. Well, that's what you see down here on the left. We also teach them to go in and grab very particular visualizations from the EPA, California EPA, et cetera. And one thing I'll note is that a lot of the environmental data that's in the public domain in the US began to become available around the 1990s, partly as a result of legislation in the wake of the Bhopal disaster that called for environmental right to know. But of course, it was synergized with just the availability of cheap computing and data visualization and GIS mapping and that kind of thing. So question 3 asks for students to describe compound vulnerabilities. ranging from economic precarity to poverty levels to discrimination or police violence. So for example, for their first, this sketch that you see on the left asks that we found data set describing high-speed internet access in Californian communities. And we use this as a proxy for the likelihood of poor access to risk information in the event of catastrophic releases of chemicals or wildfires. In figure 12 you see here is data on non-citizens in California counties, and we ask students to think about why non-citizens might be particularly vulnerable to different kinds of hazards. Particularly, and this was a visual that we used in worst case scenarios where the likelihood that non-citizens would not be in official circuits of information that encourage them to move out of harm's way. Question 4 is a stakeholder analysis, and this is a kind of analysis in a snapshot. And the students do this every case study. And students that I now have years ago tell me that this is an analysis they do in their workplaces all the time. So in the center of the sketch, they list the stakeholders, company managers, plant workers, school nurses, different stakeholders down the middle. And on the left, they list what empowers those stakeholders to take actions and act on the knowledge they have in the community. And on the right, what corrodes that ability. And so for plant workers, they know a lot about plant operations, and that certainly is empowering, but deeply institutionalized disrespect for worker knowledge pushes against that being a community asset. So this is really a kind of snapshot of both stakeholders and the kind of power grid that they operate within. And if I can get students to really be able to do this little analysis on their own, it's a great show that the case study teaching is working. Question 5 is asking what stakeholders have done and importantly haven't done. As I'm sure you're aware, in many cases, both governments and polluting companies are more notable for their lack of action than their actions. So in this sketch, we asked them to identify very specific things that stakeholder groups have done. In this case, what you're seeing here is a partnership between Greenpeace, a national or international environmental group, partnering with a local grassroots group, pushing a couple of actions forward. And in the third column would be actions they haven't taken. For example, if they'd found information that said that this coalition did not support a certain action. And so this sketch would be, students are encouraged to fill out what they can find information on. So they're encouraged to kind of keep pushing to be able to expand it, but it's challenging to populate this sketch with available information. Question 6 is, what is the role of media and big environmental organizations, government agencies, and companies in covering the problem, providing information, drawing attention to it? So this is there's a lot more sketches that we can build to support this question that really, really extend students' media literacy and data literacy. These sketches are pretty simple. On the one you see on the left, just ask them to note what coverage they've gotten by big mainstream newspapers and news outlets. One thing that's really noteworthy in the US that the students see very quickly is in the last couple of decades, just the closure of many local news agencies. And so they're able, in going to look for that and not finding it, they're finding media deserts across the state. And as I mentioned earlier, part of this sketch also asked them to check out and see what kinds of environmental hazards are described on a Wikipedia site for a community or county, and what discussion there is of this. So very, very focused little exercises we have students do that give them content that they can use to address the case study question in their reports. So the question they're asking in this report is, how have environmental problems in this setting been reported on by media, environmental organizations, companies, and government agencies, and what data divergences have there been in that reporting? Question 7 asks them to identify local actions. And I'll note that with the more junior researchers, often just discerning what's the difference in a local and a non-local action is a moment of learning. And so local actions, we say, are actions that can be carried out, funded and decided upon at the local level. And so in this sketch, they identify a problem like residents living very near high-risk industrial facilities. And in the center column, a solution that we've seen in other places that we've learned about through the other course material are home buyouts that allow residents to relocate. And in the right column, they're encouraged to imagine what it would look like to advocate for and gain traction on that local action in the county that they're focused on. So again, asking them to identify a problem, identify how that problem has been addressed in various places, and how it might be downscaled to their particular community. And again, all of this is, one could spend a lifetime asking even a small number of these questions. The case study framework very purposely asks them to do a lot in a little time in order to pull a lot of complexity into a single frame. This is, in local actions, a more creative sketch that they do is to design that would encourage local action in the communities they study. So in this one on the left, they're asked to design a program that would enroll high school students in addressing the environmental problems in their community. And we give them an example of a couple of different initiatives that have done that to give them fuel for their imagination. In the sketch on the right, we ask them to design a public art project, a climate art project that would stimulate public discussion about climate change and the need for climate change planning. And I find it important to have these kind of creative sketches interlaced with the more technical sketches, again, to help students understand the many different kinds of thinking and critical analytic skills and creative skills that need to come together in this work. Extra local actions we've identified as state and national and transnational actions. So for example, in this visual, they use a interactive data set created by the National Resources Defense Council that monetizes the benefits of the Clean Air Act in different counties in the US. This data visualization was created just recently in an effort to push back against Trump's rollbacks of clean air regulation. I saw it written about in a news article and just clipped it and put it into our file so that it could become something that we shared with students and integrated into a case study framework. It's an example of why working collaboratively on this case study work is really welcome, because all of us are going to know about and access and be able to throw ideas for what students can work with into the mix. Question 9 is ask students for recommendations for future research. And so the first part asked them just to identify data that they wanted to have that they couldn't find. And here it's like it might be out there and they didn't find it, but it's just a kind of quick pass at data that they thought would be useful. We then ask them to identify three kinds of quantitative studies that would help characterize the community they're focused on. What kind of pollution research, what kind of health research, and what kind of social survey research. And again, just to get them thinking about the different kinds of knowledges that can be leveraged in this kind of analysis. And then last, we asked them to design a qualitative research proposal, a kind of rapid design. And one of the most important learning moments in the course is when they start being able to identify a qualitative question themselves. At the outset of the course, often they start their qualitative research saying they want to understand cancer levels in the community. And, you know, we're often in the Google Docs with them, and our comment is like, you can't answer that question with qualitative data. What kind of question can you answer with qualitative data? And so having them actually get their hands on this and try and do it themselves with us working alongside them in a Google Doc is a really, it's where we understand what they're not understanding and can scaffold them to kind of move their capabilities to the next level. And I'll say that, like, the trouble students have articulating a qualitative research question, we really weren't aware of how much trouble they were having with that until we actually were watching them work in their Google Docs. So it's a very interesting pedagogical space to be in documents with groups of students. And then the last question is ask them to do an intersecting injustice analysis. And for this, we also provide a sketch that scaffolds their work. And we ask them to identify, I think it's 10 types of injustice. So data injustice is, are stakeholders missing data they need to understand their own conditions? Is there economic injustice? Are people also facing income inequality overburdened by environmental hazards? Is there procedural justice? Is there a lack of access to legal remedy and to government agencies to resolve their problems? Is there media justice? Is there coverage of the issues in their areas? And again, this is a really hard sketch, but getting them just to ponder these different kinds of injustices that compound to produce environmental injustice enhances their analytic capabilities. And we try and scaffold this work in different ways. For example, in this slow disaster case study, we really focus on reproductive and intergenerational injustice because we're able to point them to scientific studies that walk them through those connections. And then for intersecting injustices, this is just an example of how we kind of walk them through an analysis. This is child blood lead levels, which is a data visualization that they could have used in the hazard section of their case study, but we have them include this figure in the injustice case because we have them point to it in claiming that there's reproductive injustice. If an aspect of reproductive injustice is the incapacity of parents and guardians to raise children in healthy environments, having high blood lead levels that parents and guardians have no control over is empirical evidence pointing to that injustice. So again, trying to help them learn to link ethical claims to empirical claims, which of course is challenging for all of us. And so we're just we want to help start them towards that kind of capability. So again, these are the learning outcomes of the course. We have a lot that we're trying to accomplish, and I constantly worry that we're trying to do too much in one course. But I do think part of the value of the approach is trying to do many things together, the kind of multi-factor focus of it, the way it combines empirical work and ethical and justice analyses. It asks them to learn to document and analyze, but also reflect on and articulate their own ethical values. And it's that kind of mix that I think has a powerful and enduring impact on the students. But I really welcome your feedback on how we could make it, how we could improve the approach in different renderings of it. So there's work in many different directions ahead. One of the things that I'll invite you to is we've established this Beyond Environmental Injustice Teaching Collective, and there's a link to this this web page in the one of the last slides that I've shared with you. And on that, there is a link to the email network that we're using to share materials. And we really welcome your participation. There's students on it. We see it as a space to build our capacity to teach a next generation of environmental justice advocates and leaders, and we'd like it to become a global network. And so figuring out how we can link to educational institutions in Japan would be a real value for the network as a whole.
Thank you very much. Do you want to add a few things?
No, I just wanted to say I'm done, and thank you for listening.
Thank you very much. I mean, these two sessions have been very dense indeed, and I'm sure, so we have time for questions. I'm sure we'll have questions, and because you were asking for feedback, I'm sure that there will be also some feedback. So does anyone have any question? I'm seeing a raised hand, sorry. And Okada Sensei, please go ahead.
Well, thank you so much for your really excellent presentation. I really enjoyed it. And I had a lot of questions in the beginning, but you answered pretty much most of them. So I want to go from a really practical question. We talked about interdisciplinarity, right? Yeah. And over here, at least in this institution, I teach here, and especially on the humanities side, or humanities or social science side here, it's really a sort of mixed bag. So there are many, many different kinds of students coming over here, especially in the English program here. And I'm definitely not specialized in data science. And I'm a historian, and I'm specialized in Southeast Asia. And so sometimes it's very difficult. And especially, I want to ask this question to you because you've been in this business for a long time. And I'm sure that you did your research before the coming of internet. So I think your approach to data must have changed a lot over the time. So, but here my question is, there's so much data out there on the internet, and you also said that you guide the students by studying about data before the class and making a through preparation for it. But and over here in Japan, in my environment, it's multi-language. So sometimes, I don't understand Chinese, but some Chinese data might be out there, but I have no idea. And there are some Chinese students studying about Southeast Asia here. So in that kind of case, it's pretty difficult for me to know what's out there. But they really have to know objective, numerical data in order to talk about some of the environmental issues. So in that kind of situation, do you have any advice for me?
Yeah, no, it's a really good question. I'll also say that, if I would hope that in coming years, we'll also have publicly accessible qualitative data that we can work with, because right now we're just at the beginning of an effort to archive ethnographic and oral history data. I mean, if my students could access archived interviews with community members in these communities, it would so enrich what they could do. So I think we also need to put pressure on historians and anthropologists to think about creating a research commons where students can access. But in terms of how do we know what's out there, it really is one of many motivations to be collaborative, because it's really hard. But like if we had a place where we could say, look, there is a really interesting Chinese data set here that we need almost like an index of it, and just an annotated index where you sort of say, this is what you can do with it. This is how it's accessible. You know, an interesting point is I have a little bit of research a few years ago in Beijing for our air pollution project. And we ran a workshop with students on data ethnography and just had them go look for data, asthma data, ozone data. And they found a surprising amount of public data, and they were surprised it was there. But what, you know, the next step would be to say, okay, how could, it's almost like a hackathon kind of meeting, have a go data find meeting. And so curate a set of data that we can work with. So I think that part of it is we need a collaborative effort to pull data that you can use. Something that I'm interested in doing that is, I haven't done yet, it's like, what data is there in the UN system? I mean, all their data is open,
right.
that we could use. How do we, and one thing is like, if you learn that data is available in one place, you know to go look for it in another place. Like, for example, school absence data. I've come to think is really interesting kind of proxy data for other things. Probably you could get that in Japan. I don't know where, but you know, once you know I find it useful, you can go see if you could find it.
Right.
So I'd like to set up a collaborative structure where we jointly figure out how to actually both curate data our students can use and continually refresh that kind of common space.
Okay, well, thank you so much for now. I have a few more questions, but if there is time, I'll ask them again. Thank you.
Thank you. Amishi, you have a question.
Thank you, Professor Giroux. Good morning, Dr. Fortun. I'm an undergraduate student with Professor Giroux, and I was really curious about the part where we talked about some data being available and some data not being available. But I also think that in terms of the data that is available, there's common criticism that it's not disaggregated by, say, race, gender, or other ethnic minorities or distribution of disabilities. And the reason why I'm asking this is because we also discussed injustice analysis. And I think that it's not just the existence of injustice, but the documented nature of such injustice in the data that might help students identify that injustice. So I'm wondering if from your experience from the teaching side, you think this data is available, so disaggregated data is available or not, how it could concretely help students in their research. And if your students have tried to creatively try to counter the non-availability of such data, then what kind of strategies have they adopted? Thank you.
It's a great question. And I think one of the things that students learn is the importance of data being aggregated and collected in different ways, and just helping them see the importance of noticing what data is available or not is a big teaching outcome, because I want them to become data advocates, you know, when they leave my course. And I think that one, and seeing what, being creative about what data we have, what data we need and can become advocates for, is a critical part of not only environmental advocacy, but just kind of civic advocacy generally. And in, you know, in many countries in the world, race and ethnic data is very purposely not collected. And so how do you, what should we be doing about that? And I don't know the answer, but I know we need to be working on it. And you know, for example, in the US, the way that the COVID-19 pandemic has really revealed the gaps in the data about stratification of all kinds, household data, race and ethnic data, et cetera, I think is opened the possibility of a public discussion about that we didn't have before. And so again, wanting to grow, to be in a community of practice where we're advocating for that kind of data work to be done.
Thank you so much.
Wow, you have another question.
Yes, it's more like two comments than questions. I found it interesting that you mentioned this the UN database and all the problems with data. One very interesting initiative that I came in contact with lately was the Open Data Initiative for Resilience by World Bank. They have this index in which they measure how much data is available by countries. And interestingly enough, there is no records for Japan and United States, but I'm sure a lot of those data is available. It's like, it depends on public contribution. And there is like a lot of interesting articles and resources on this website. And by reading all of these papers, I got in contact with the OpenStreetMaps participatory mapping. And I think it's so interesting. And I also have some sort of purpose to use the participatory mapping approach in my research too. I don't know if that will be possible because of COVID, but I think it's something that goes beyond just the action of researchers and data analysts and puts the work also in the hands of the community, because they can participate into mapping and produce the relevant data. And by producing it, they also know how to put it into action and be more, how can I say, active, more engaged in actually using all of that data to improve their own communities. And that was very inspiring to me. These two specific initiatives, the Open Data for Resilience initiative and also the OpenStreetMaps, because especially the OpenStreetMaps, it can be like layer targeted the way you want. You can simply create variables as you wish and map the way you want and make all of that data publicly available. I think it's a really powerful resource. Thank you very much.
Well, I hope that you will join the Beyond Environmental Injustice Teaching Collective, because one of the things that it's supported by the Disaster STS research platform. And one of the things that we can do there is create this annotated list of data sets where if you identify this World Bank sets, you put it up, and we can put some resources with it, but then create a way for everyone who's used it to comment on it. It's no good for sub-Saharan Africa, but it's pretty good for Brazil, or so that the goods and bads of these data resources we can develop community knowledge about. For example, the Notre Dame Gian data resource, I have students work with it. I need to learn more about how people who have used the data have found it valuable and not, and so we need a kind of research enterprise around these data sets to make them useful both for our students and for the communities. Like I would like to put this resilience data collected by the World Bank or the Notre Dame group in front of communities and say, does this match your understanding? And if not, what do we need to add? Because data like that can be an elicitation device can elicit community dialogue and planning, I think, in important ways.
Certainly, I would definitely join. Thank you very much for
please
coming.
be in touch. Yeah.
Thank you. And if the participants, if you want to share any information, you can use, of course, the chat. Sharon, sorry for calling you by your first name. I see your raised hand. Please go ahead.
Fine to call me by my first name. Thank you. I thought it might be interesting. I've been adopting and adapting a lot of the model that Kim has developed, which has been so helpful in my teaching. And my background is in both anthropology and history. And I'm currently teaching in the gender studies department where, again, in the what Kim's calls the lower division, the first and second year students often come from many, many different kinds of backgrounds. And because of these so-called general education requirements we have, the students are required to take a certain distribution of classes outside their primary field of study. So I also get a lot of engineering, biological, physical science students, as well as humanities and social sciences. So the students are kind of interested in being in this kind of mixture. But I wanted to say more about the students who are in the third and fourth year, mostly majors, and our gender studies majors mostly are planning to go to law school or some kind of medical health profession or to graduate school, and often in policy studies. So I found across all of these groups that using this infrastructure that Kim has designed, that it's a way to talk to the students about research design, and especially for the undergraduates to say, usually at this stage of your education, you're learning about research results and policy statements and so forth. And these assignments are more about research design and policy design. And what are the elements of all this? And most of them have never encountered this. And this is so helpful, again, when the students are coming from very different perspectives or have very different goals, because all of them will need to learn how to do research design and also do often how to design a policy, no matter what kind of work they're going to go into. So on one level, I present it as very practical, and they love being able to go to this infrastructure that Kim has referred to, where they can see what students in other courses at other universities have done similar work. It's very important to them. And the last point I wanted to make is in Southern California, I'm at UCLA, living in faculty housing, that we have students whose families are from all over the world. In Los Angeles, about since 2000, I think it is 40% of the people were born outside the United States. So we have students in our classes from countries, families at least, are from countries all over the world. And to then, when I give them examples, study some place, for example, in California, but also maybe in a country where your family has a lot of ties. So we can juxtapose these. And then the students who know other languages can then say, okay, I found, and I give them some data sets that they can look at from other countries, often from UNESCO and OECD, and say, just find, there you can go to countries, find a place, and then juxtapose it with a place that you know in California, for example. So a lot of our students have this kind of experience, and the ones that don't often have an sort of an imagined future of being able to travel to some other place. So I say, pick some place locally here and locally there and juxtapose. So again, I find the students from all these different backgrounds find using this model Kim has designed to be very interesting. You can tell even online like this, the students start leaning forward and not just sitting back and nodding, or they turn off, they're no longer muted or stopping the video. They're really engaged. So I think it's a great platform to use. Thank you.
Well, I'll just say in responding to Sharon, thank you, is that my favorite role as a teacher is really to kind of create the space for students to work. And I think in part because, I have a lot of hope invested in a new generation of students growing into roles in our society that will really make some really fundamental changes. And they're going to need to be very analytically sharp, creative, feel empowered in the kind of knowledge that they bring. And so, like asking them to learn, many, many concepts is demanding of them, but I want them to leave my course knowing that they've got a bag full of analytic concepts that they can take out in the world. And I'm not there yet, but I think they leave my course connected to each other but I'd like them to be connected, not, you know, to students down the road at UCLA, but also to students in Tokyo and China and Brazil, because that's what would really start, it would be another thing that empowers that, that generation.
Emma, please go ahead.
Hi there. Thank you for the second half of your presentation. I just wanted to quickly sort of, I haven't really collated my thoughts, but since you brought up the word hope, something that has really kind of marked my kind of life as a student, I just recently graduated, is kind of the realization that the student community, as we become more aware of environmental injustice and become increasingly passionate, I also notice that there are times when fatalism can grow in tandem or in parallel. And sometimes the weight of that kind of quashes some of the drive to go out and really investigate, to really analyze, to really assess. And of course, this ends up being completely counterproductive. And I wonder what your thoughts are about that, not necessarily counteracting it, or if you've encountered it at all, just what your impression is of that kind of tendency.
That's a really great question. And I'll say that I lean on my students pretty hard to step up, and, you know, that we, and I, you know, I tell them stories from my own early career working on the Bhopal case, where you couldn't do what you did because you were confident like it was going to succeed. You did it because it was the right thing. And it was, we were obligated to share our knowledge expertise, which everyone in university has to share. And also to learn to respect and leverage the expertise of community partners. And so I think that I really try and persuade my students that they have a responsibility to step up and that they can make a difference, that a different world order is possible and that they can really play an important role. And so while I respect the kind of intelligence of fatalism, I really call upon my students to kind of step in front of it. And one thing I'll put back to you as a recent grad is that, you know, I want students to stay connected to the issues and to the creative work after they leave my course. And one of the things that we started by students, because I have no capability, is using Instagram as a way to keep students connected. It's not for course logistics, like this is due, this and that, but it's more for staying in the conversation. And from your experience, is that a space that students in Japan would share and join, or what communication media would be a space to link students, like once they move through our courses and we want them to be linked in a community of practice, like where would they come?
That's a really interesting question. I think particularly in Japan, the SNS space is really quite active, and I'm curious what other undergraduates and researchers have to say about what online spaces or what digital spaces have proved most useful for them. I think in my, I suppose, limited experience with social media, Instagram does appear to be very much an area of conversation, of continual kind of influx. I think that's the nature of the platform, that it is sort of continuous barrage of information. And I suppose we could argue whether or not that really foments, I guess, like nuanced conversation. That is one issue that I've encountered, that it very much plays to kind of the rapid soundbite aspect of our kind of information flows, rather than a space where, akin to a classroom, you could really have a nuanced discussion. But I'm curious what other students have experienced, if anyone.
I'll say that I just had a discussion with the students in the kind of advanced version of my class about how they run the Instagram space, like how to link it to the Disaster STS platform, which is the more slow burn place. I mean, and I think that was absolutely partly what we bring to it as researchers is that slower analytic space. But we also want to share that space with community members and meet younger people where they're in conversation. So yeah, I'd love to hear from others too.
Maybe one comment from one student before taking the final question. I can see that Okada Sensei has a question, maybe a final one. All right, please, so Okada Sensei.
Oh, okay, so can I speak? Okay, well, I think as far as I am concerned, I keep the mailing list. It's a sort of traditional old style, maybe. So, okay, so that's that. And my question is that, you know, I'm sure that many of the issues that you deal with are pretty divisive. You know, even among the students, I mean, there might be really contentious. So, in your approach, do you think you're going beyond this contentious politics or identity politics?
That's a good question. And, you know, when I taught in an engineering environment, I found that many of my students were very sensitive if things were contentious, and they just kind of did not want to enter that space. And so I found that an important role for me as a teacher was to invite them into debated spaces and to give them the skills to work within them and to really leverage different perspectives. And so I teach them to leverage different perspectives, which is one way to deal with the question of, am I partisan? I also try and demonstrate to them repeatedly that I respect different perspectives, but I also expect them to bring analysis and evidence to those perspectives. And so, for example, you know, I've gotten, you know, sometimes I'll have a student that says that they don't agree that environmental harms disproportionately affect African Americans. Mm-hmm. And that simply can't be supported empirically. And so to say that, you know, position taking does have responsibilities. The other thing that's a really important part of the course, which gets around that, is we talk about a lot of different kinds of different reasons behind what we talk about as data divergence. Everything from greenwashing, you know, where the fossil fuel companies are just trying to cover people's eyes, to manipulation of scientific data, not falsification, but designing a study so you don't even see the problem at all. And this is where a history of science and social studies of science approach is really important, because the way that the story behind dissenting views is something that we can teach students to analyze that too. And so that they aren't paralyzed by the dissent. No, so it's a complex space, because I think it's really important to encourage divergent views to be brought into an analysis. But especially now, there's often, you know, there's often industrial interest shaping the data itself, the views, and so it's a constant. It's a very I very conscientiously take that on rather than try and avoid it.
Well, thank you. I mean, that's excellent, really. You know, I also try to go into primary sources instead of like arguing my way out. Okay, thank you so much.
Thank you very much again. I think maybe a very final short question and a very final short question. So Bella, please.
Hello, this is Bella from University of Tokyo and a former undergrad student at UCI. And I have a question about how to mitigate the gap between different disciplines. So my background is like I studied economics when I was an undergrad student, and now I'm studying public policy. But I really want to do like environmental study for my PhD plan. I found like it's really important and also like challenging to like mitigate the gap between these different disciplines, because like when we deal with environmental issues we take different methods, and we also like look at the question from different perspectives, and sometimes like there are lots of misunderstandings and lots of gaps. So like I wonder, yeah.
Well, this is why we have faith in your generation, is I think that you're going to have to do a kind of interdisciplinary research that really hasn't been done before. But I think one way that we can lay ground for that is to do the analyses so that we understand why there's differences of perspective, differences of, in some disciplines, they think one kind of data is really robust and useful. And in another discipline, they think that kind of data is noisy and unusable. And so how do you bring that together? And I'll give you an example. In the analyses of whether environmental improvements in an urban area leads to gentrification, so raising real estate costs that push poor people out. You've got good people arguing both yes and no. And if you look and say, and interestingly, if you look closely, it's because they're in different disciplines looking at different scales of the problem. And so neither of them, in this case, it's much more complicated than if they're just covering data for industry purposes. It's actually sincere, good researchers that are seeing the problems in different ways, but because they're focused on a different scale, you're using different data, they're seeing like the duck instead of the rabbit. And so, but I think that bringing those research communities together will be easier if we understand why they're so divergent, and try and not use terms like that's just trash data, or that's sloppy, or, all of the different ways we dismiss other fields of analysis, or that's reductive. In my work on disasters, if you're responsible for responding to a disaster the second day after, you need reductive data. That's the data that has traction. And so to learn to be respectful of the need for many different kinds of data, many different kinds of analyses, and learn to discern what one sees with one and not the other. In the data science world, they often talk about data integration as though computers can do it. And I think the real challenge of data integration is in designing collaborations where that integration it's far from straightforward, but that's where the work is. And so I encourage you to, as Sharon Trawick mentioned, really develop your skills in research design and design projects that bring together people that really bring different views into problem characterization.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much for helpful advice.
Thank you very much to all for your questions, feedback. Thank you so much, Kim. I think it's getting really late for you in the evening. So I really appreciate that you could share so generously with us your experience as well as your research. You mentioned several times about collaborations. That's for sure a thing we'll keep in mind. I think that many of us are actually very interested in keeping on, making sure that this discussion is really going on. You shared with us a lot of links. I will continue to share those links with students here and some of my colleagues. A final word for our participants. So you know that thank you also to Emma for the organization. Thanks to the translator, the interpreters. Emma sent you an email saying that we are circulating a short survey, and it's really in order for us to have some feedback about this the workshop. I really hope, I was mentioning at the beginning that this workshop is the first one of a series. We would like to organize other workshops dealing with case-based education. Actually, I would be very interested to have Kim Fortun once again, and this time on campus, I mean in Japan, for a face-to-face conversation in some near future. So thank you again so much, Kim. Hope to see you soon, and we will keep in touch anyway. Thank you so much. Thanks to you all. Goodbye.
Thank you, everybody. I look forward to being in touch.
Yeah, thank you again.